This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is Seth Goldenberg. He is a designer, curator, and entrepreneur. He's all about change, innovation. His new book, Radical Curiosity, Questioning Commonly Held Beliefs to Imagine Flourishing Futures. This is one of those business books that, regardless of how you might think you feel about Seth in our conversation, I'm telling you, it's the kind of book that you pick up and you start to go through and you're like, oh, wow, that's a great perspective. That's a great perspective. That's a great perspective. I found myself doing that time and time again. And, sometimes maybe it's just the feeling. You want to walk away from a book with the feeling of being excited and energized and ready to take on the next day. Radical Curiosity does it for me. And plus, anyone that listens to this podcast knows I use that word curious perhaps too much, but I love being curious. Without any further delay, let's jump right into my guest today, Seth Goldenberg. The dashing photo is from Beijing 7 or 8 years ago, 9 years ago. I'm not sure. I still look the same, though. I'll give myself credit, but I still have the same hair. The weight hasn't changed. If the hair changes and the weight changes, then I'm going to have to give her the photo. So,
that's funny.
Let me tell you something about me. I think this will help set up our conversation. As the author of a bunch of investment books, like 7, I started doing this podcast. I eventually decided talking to only traders was boring. My first main non-trader was Daniel Kahneman. And that kind of just opened up Pandora's box. That picture you're looking at, that happens to be on a tour that I was in, as I mentioned, Beijing. And then I never left Asia. I've been in Saigon for the last 10 years. Gen X guy.
Oh, wow. Beautiful.
One other fun things before we get started, because I saw the name in your book. Back in the day, after a bunch of iterations of my first website in the late 1990s, I was like, I need a professional designer. I need somebody that can help with, quote, usability. So I found this guy in Chicago before he had something called Basecamp. When I convinced Jason Fried to come on this podcast, I was like, Jason, you have to come on, because I was actually a 37 Signals web design client before there was a Basecamp. He had to say yes to that.
That's awesome. That's great.
That's the setup for who you're talking today. Your perspective is really, really cool. Look, I do a podcast where I do interviews with people. So, of course, I love questions. You must love questions a lot too, huh?
Just saying, right?
Yeah.
That's good. I love your energy.
There'll probably be at least one time in this podcast where I'm going to say, I'm curious.
Nice. I love your energy. It's infectious.
Well, I don't know. Maybe that's why people keep listening. I don't know. But I got to tell you, at the end of one of these things, I'm like, okay, I got to lay down.
Oh, yeah. Performance, right?
It is kind of me, but you got to bring it, right? You got to bring something.
Yeah, for sure.
Tell me about this word, though, because this is an important word to me. It's a great place to jump into. Why is curiosity such an important word to you? When did it first become important to you?
What a delicious place to begin. For me, curiosity is a mindset. I think I've always had it. I didn't necessarily know to name it that. I grew up as an artist, a painter, quite a young age. I was sharing my artworks in galleries by the age of 11. I've evolved to become a designer, but I cross the two typologies of creativity of artist maker and design problem solver. I think that curiosity for me has become a new language that brings my own creative practice to a higher level that isn't necessarily about being a craftsperson or a specialist in that artist and designer continuum, but is a mindset that anyone can have and leaders need now more than ever. I think it's important because it's surprising to me how much is unfolding in our world and how few questions sometimes we're asking about that. I wrote Radical Curiosity to basically be a manifesto and a call to arms to bring curiosity back from the dangers of extinction.
I think that's a great way to say it as a guy that loves dinosaurs and has actually found an interesting whale vertebrae from like 60 million years ago. The word curiosity, the feeling of curiosity, the way people interact with it and react to it, it's not a natural state of being. I'm lucky I get to do this podcast to talk with people like yourself, all these interesting professors and authors and whatnot. So there's this kind of natural infectious curiosity that I get to experience on this podcast. But on the day-to-day with people, there's a lot of walls up.
Yeah, and I think we pass through our days in many ways really inhabiting the models that came before us. Sometimes I think when the messages and the policies or the frameworks or the business models are so deeply entrenched and entangled in all parts of our life, sometimes we maybe give them more respect than they deserve. In fact, much of our lives are governed simply by folks that came before us that thought that was the good idea at the time. For me, it's quite empowering to really unleash curiosity, to really question, is this the way it is? Is this the only way it could be? To your point, I think we kind of move through our day, but sometimes the sheer surround sound of how things are can, to your point of calling it a wall, even maybe not such a wall, but just a reinforcement that the dominance of how we move through our lives is the singular and only option. It's just simply not true.
I should add as another side tangent, you mentioned artist, painter, mother painter, uncle painter, great-grandmother painter, and my grandfather could carve amazing feet on Victorian furniture. I don't know that I inherited that side of their creativity, but something that you bring up in your work that I thought was really interesting and given to where I'm at right now, you mentioned, I think I won't quote you correctly, 11% of the states, U.S. citizens, traveled abroad in 2019. The numbers of folks that have a passport, smaller. Not smaller than that. I think it's around 30%, maybe a little bit higher now. There's something that happens, and not just to sit here and tap myself on the back and say, oh, Mike, you're so wonderful. You went and got lost in Asia and didn't come back. That's not the point. But the point is that until people get out of that comfort zone and try something wild, I don't want to use the word crazy, it sounds trite, something to get out of that comfort zone, you might not ever get to that point if somebody grows up in the suburbs like I did outside DC. A lot of friends and family there, bless them. There's some horse blinders on until you see outside of that field of vision.
I love your story as an expression of this idea. I describe it in the book as radius of exposure, quite both literally and as a mental model. In fact, many of us don't travel far beyond our comfort zones, from the spaces of what is known, what is comfortable for us. And I think it's natural. Human beings are creatures of comfort. I think radical curiosity, it's a hopeful and optimistic view that if we're going to build new worlds, we also have to be exposed to the diversity and the full continuum of all that the world is and can be. How we travel, or how we accept travel and embrace travel, not merely as vacation, which I think is the branded industry economic lens of travel, but travel maybe as a higher order way of welcoming curiosity and moving beyond what we know in order to open up our worldview.
Well, you're also talking about, at the root, about learning. And I love a comment from your world that I'm going to add the word typical, but let's say typical education interferes with learning. In my case, I don't think I learned anything in school. Just some basics, but not how to write, not how to talk, none of that. That's all just outside chase the tail of something, and then I end up there. I love that idea. It doesn't make a difference whether someone could say they're on the left spectrum, the right spectrum, whatever country, it doesn't make a difference. If people are not observant enough to know today that education interferes with learning, they should literally stop our conversation and figure out why that's a true statement.
I love that. I love your zest for my shared critique, or at least inquiry, of the kind of institutionalized learning. There's some really important voices who, over the years, whether it's you shared your family's background as painters and craftsmen, I think Buckminster Fuller or Paulo Freire or Bell Hooks, these incredible critical pedagogists who really are advocates for being with it, being in the world. Somehow we've adopted, at least in the United States, the predominant model of learning is a kind of removal from the real world. And I think there's a variety of subgenres, from action-based research to service learning to community and public engagement, which we've been advocates for in our studio. But I think you're right that education interfering with our learning, sometimes experiential learning is not a curricular language. Experiential learning is about life and living. That's the kind of front seat we think will be the model of personal transformation of the future. And I think we're seeing some really interesting inroads that are blurring where the educational establishment lies and where technologies and lifestyle brands are expanding. You think of Airbnb's experience ecosystem. I mean, suddenly you can, for $12, set up a master class with the world's most incredible craftsmen on a micro topic in an inch of the world you've never even heard of. That makes that radius of exposure open up, but also it reinforces the idea that you don't have to be in a four-walled classroom to transform yourself.
I can think of K through 12. I can think of college. I can think of my Singaporean friends and other Asian friends across Asia, and how focused everyone is on the, quote, memorization to get a grade, end quote. I never did well with that. I mean, you probably already guessing that. I never understood it. And it was always sit down, shut up. Maybe the teacher didn't say it like that, but it was essentially sit down and shut up and just get your scores, so to speak. The tough part with that is there's a whole army of folks that work as teachers, K through 12 college. They, to get to those positions, generally didn't have to follow your prescription. They had to follow the memorization, get the grades part. So it's a real challenge. Like, how do you stop the train that's out of the station being repopulated every year with people that are going down a path that's not about radical curiosity? I mean, maybe that's controversial sounding, but I don't think it's about radical curiosity. And stopping that train to get people off to a different perspective is really tough, isn't it?
Absolutely. You're describing, we're right now talking about learning as a particular space or method or practice. But I also think that that foundation really sets the cement, if you will, for habits of mind that we carry throughout all business, whatever industry. Part of what I propose is that even think about the terminal degree in business as the traditional Harvard MBA or whatever university it might be, the master's in business administration. I think sometimes we think of leadership and management as the prescription and the facilitation of pre-existing knowledge. So what you're describing now, for me, that memorization, that route, recall, it further gets embodied even at the most senior leadership levels, where it's as though all of human knowledge is a blueprint and a playbook. And our job is, as problems, challenges, opportunities arise, to just go to page 183 and apply a model solution that already exists. Now, that was valuable during an era of growth, during an era of industrialization, during an era of mass acquisition of base knowledge. Today is more complex. Today, especially post-COVID, we're facing an existential set of challenges in which maybe that very playbook needs to be questioned. The assumptions that that knowledge is designed by have been rendered less valuable or even false. What you're asking and where that memorization reaches its glass ceiling is, well, what if A, those pre-existing knowledge frameworks are no longer useful, or B, they are the very problem themselves? And I think that's the moment we find ourselves in. And it's why we believe asking harder, deeper questions. And maybe to your point, I think being comfortable with a little bit of controversy, because it goes right to the root of our core beliefs. And that's what's going to be required to transform this next era that we're finding ourselves in.
You bring up the MBA program. I did 2 years, not at Harvard. I remember that first week, Florida State with a ponytail, bad ponytail. I remember thinking in that first week, we were discussing optimal utilization of seats on an airplane. And I remember thinking to myself, what am I doing? I don't care about this at all. This is mindless. I was like, oh my God, how did I make such a bad mistake to get involved in something like that? Look, I have a lot of Harvard professors on this podcast, a lot of really smart people. I respect them. At the end of the day, it's not going to be too much different in Harvard than at Florida State than any other school. It's still going to come down to what you're talking about, which is the knowledge that's given, the knowledge that's in the books. And it's less about, okay, how do you adapt and come up with something new?
Trust me, I mean, I have a great many friends at those business schools as well. I don't think we're trying to throw anyone under the bus.
Not a lot, but a little under the bus.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Not too much under the bus. We'll back and forward over the dead body a couple times, but not kill them.
There you go. There you go. I think the best business professors in the business schools are starting to grapple with these questions. I think what you're describing, the airport example, I mean, and there are countless, it's the operationalization or the efficient utilization of assets, of capital, of frameworks for economic growth. But I think there's a new discourse happening at some of the best classrooms in America that are now saying, what's the point? What's the purpose of business? Why are we doing this at all? Are we trying to squeeze seats, or are we asking, what is the future of transportation? Why do we move about the world? Should we move about the world? What are the downstream implications of our climate, our costs, our mental health, our bodies, our families to move about the world? There's all kinds of new languages like circular economics, like the revival of the discourse on the workplace, commonly referred to as Great Resignation. But I think these bigger questions, the philosophy of our economy is kind of blowing the mathematical modeling of how many butts and seats out of the water.
This conversation takes me to a point in your work also. 3 words, 3 important words, the joy of discovery. And I can think back to showing up in a place like Vietnam for the first time, the only place I've ever come in my life, been to a lot of countries, the only place where I did not know anybody on the ground. I can still think the most important joy of discovery for me at that moment in time was the feeling as an American Gen X guy, wow, okay, this is safe, number one. And then to learn it's a lot safer than America. But then number 2 was for me, was the beauty. I found that the way the country embraced their dress, and there's a male and a female version, but predominantly the female algia, the Vietnamese dress. And I just was taken with just this embracing of beauty, just struck me. And it was like, wow, this is so cool. It's like a parallel universe. I don't want to leave. Now, somebody might say, well, what does that have to do with the Harvard MBA? Well, that's actually the whole point.
I love your story. I mean, it's clear you're a passionate advocate for the lifestyle and culture that you've brought into your life and come to visit.
I don't think you disagree.
Yeah, no, it's gorgeous. I mean, you're talking about joy, you're talking about beauty. I mean, I think, look, we need to slow down. We need to be present for what we call sensory experiences. It's like there's the classic in the business modeling of from X to Y. And we've seen countless diagrams sure many of your readers are utilizing them or writing them. And I think we're living in a time of what I call the cultural interregnum. When you juxtapose the Harvard MBA versus the joy and beauty and dress and life that you've found in Vietnam, there's these juxtapositions. And I think we're choosing what kind of world we want to live in and we want to experience and we want to build for the future generations. The cultural interregnum is essentially the idea that interregnum is a borrowed term from politics and leadership. It essentially means the space between or the transition between two regimes, pass of the baton of one elected leader to another or one school of thought to another. And I believe that culture, almost all of society, is experiencing operating system reboot. Our world is going through an interregnum, not just a mere government. And I think that from too is quite an exciting thing. And it's not merely should we have people at the office or hybrid work. Even that, which has taken a lot of oxygen out of the room, is really treating the symptom, but not the deep rootedness of who we are, what we value, what we want the human condition and the human experience to be. Those are the bigger questions that, even as you describe a more extreme juxtaposition, really come to light, because the difference between the 20th century and the 21st century couldn't be further apart.
It's an interesting rabbit hole to go down as you bring up the idea of working in the office or not working in the office. And you're talking to a guy who put up a website in 1996 in his 20s who doesn't work for anybody. Whenever I hear the conversations of whether someone's going to be doing this particular version of work for this particular company in this particular way, I always think, damn, I wish, and I know you're doing a great job of this with your work, but I wish that people could experience something else, because corporations, ultimately, they need cogs in the wheel. They need people to shuffle the paper and do the stuff. A lot of folks, they might just want that security and whatnot. There's a whole different thing that they might not even get a chance to experience if they stay on that path and never deviate.
Has that been your life since 1997?
Yes. Great timing. Okay. Here they handed out the AOL discs in 94, Netscape Public in 95, website 96, wrote some books in the early 2000s, kept writing books. A certain freedom. If people go to the typical classroom today, the typical professor is not saying, hey, you know what you really want? Maybe you don't want it, but you would at least like to try what this freedom thing feels like. Try it on for size, so to speak. People don't say that, do they? No.
I also wonder, maybe just propose an even more radical.
You can fight back against me or tell me I'm wrong. I don't care.
Well, I wonder if you've been living that lifestyle for 25 years now. It sounds, it's extraordinary. And thank God there are people like you who are working in the knowledge economy and don't look for the 9 to 5 and are constructing value and storytelling and sharing knowledge as a cultural discourse and making a living doing that. I want to keep myself honest that there's certainly the kind of, to use your earlier term, I love that you found a dinosaur. There's the dinosaur who's leading the classroom and guiding the next generation of leader. But I also think we're seeing some of that freedom that you're describing emerge outside of the classroom and almost as a protest of the classroom. I do think that the Great Resignation, I do think that the Black Lives Matter movement, I do think the Me Too movement, I do think that there are extraordinary conditions that are emerging that are in service to that freedom that you're describing. Reclamation of power, refusal that, no, this is not the only way to do so. I question whether or not college will be relevant. And also, if you and I are talking about the kind of ideologies that emerging leaders are shaped by, I wonder if the professor or the university will be or retain the center of gravity that it had on your and my generation. I think we're already seeing pretty compelling evidence that it hasn't. Now, that doesn't mean that university has no role, but it's fascinating to look at the role of comedians as social critics, the role of travel, as we talked earlier in this discussion. All kinds of other diversified centers of gravity are actually writing what maybe the new emerging narrative might become.
You mean never growing up?
Indeed. May we not?
I was having a text conversation today. He will go nameless for his privacy. One of the most successful entrepreneurs in the history of America, who happens to be in the country that I'm in today. I just said, you know what's so amazing is you found something that most people in our home country will never even know to go look for. Hell, even find. They're not going to even know to go look for it. You just brought up two issues inside of America, the Me Too and the Black Lives Matter. That's an interesting perspective for me too, as a guy who, I hate labels, but I kind of would call myself growing up, now that I've learned some of these labels, probably a classical liberal. What's interesting living in a place like Vietnam is to watch the hustle, to watch the spirit, to watch the cooperation. It becomes infectious. All this time that I've been here, I haven't seen violence. I'm not saying violence doesn't exist, but I've not seen violence. These things really shape you in terms of probably just by osmosis, a little bit of Buddhism too. We're opening up a can of worms with this type of conversation.
Yeah. What's dangerous about it that excites or intrigues you? I'd be curious.
I don't know if it's really dangerous necessarily. I mean, here's an interesting thought for me and you, is that if we both weren't talking on air, how different would we sound? Do we tie one arm behind our back because we're on air? Do we? Subconsciously. Because I always try to figure out, where am I? Am I to the edge? Am I too far over? Have I not gone far enough? And I think those are the kinds of questions you like.
I love that as an invitation. Maybe because I'm less on air than your incredible life has taken you.
I don't know if it's that incredible.
I would just say maybe whether we're on air or not, I do think that we shy away from the real stuff. Radical curiosity, a particular breed of curiosity. Radical comes from the Latin root radicalis, which really means getting to the roots of things. I'm not an advocate for the passive curiosity, a kind of, ooh, what does this taste like? Let me try this lollipop. I think there's an intentional kind of curiosity that really is about challenging the very roots and assumptions of things. What do we really mean by health? What do we really mean by equity? What do we really mean by justice? I find it fascinating that we tend to avoid the most complex and essential questions of our time. An example I often use is Obamacare. I worked on the 2008 Democratic National Convention on Obama's behalf. I'm a huge fan. It's not a criticism of Obama. It's more the state of how the world and how governance has unfolded. But Obamacare, when we think about it, it wasn't really about what is health. What do we mean by health? How can we redefine our national policy, position, discourse, definition, North Star on health? At the end of the day, it was really about who pays for it. Even when we see our elected leaders in the presidential races stand up and say, this is my position on healthcare, what they really mean is, who gets the bill? Is it the government? Is it private? Is it public? These kinds of questions. I think that plumbing and procedural procurement, it's almost a blind spot where we don't even realize we're not actually really confronting, do we think we should live forever? Do we want 90% of the resources to be spent on the last 6 months, 6 weeks of our lives? We're just talking about who gets the invoice. I fear for a society that doesn't have the spaces and the language to really talk about the real stuff, which I think is what you're getting at.
I'm currently in World Health Organization rankings, the least obese country in the world. I happen to come from, as you know, drum roll please, excluding a few South Pacific islands, America is the most obese country in the world. So it's interesting you bring up Obamacare because people can have these policy debates and say, well, I like it or I don't like it. The radical curiosity side of me starts to say, what in blazes is wrong with America? Conservative friend that says, well, Mike, it's the food everyone's eating. And other people must say, well, hold on, what about restraints? I say to myself, how in blazes can we keep having these conversations and debates, again, taking this to another level, about who pays for the bill for healthcare without the personal responsibility for folks to decrease their size? And America just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And everyone knows that this is the lion's share of the healthcare costs. It's one of these things where it's an uncomfortable truth. We'll talk about healthcare costs, we'll talk about healthcare programs, but we never get to the root of it all. Drives me crazy.
This brings up another idea in the book. One of the things I tried to do, the book is really a collection of 28 vignettes. It's designed modularly to just pick up and read almost like a series of essays. And at the end of the book, in order to help people look at ways to put radical curiosity into practice, we codify 28 practices, 28 key observations, principles, or key ideas. And one of them that you're describing, inviting, is this idea of what I call fourth places. And I think that there's a lot of conversation about the sociology of the third place. We know that the first place is the home, the second place is the work place, the work environment, the third place is social neighborhood association environments where social capital is really fused. But I propose that there might need to be a fourth place, particularly almost like lightning charged version of a third place, because third place is just merely objective social capital exchange may not be enough for the moment we're living in. I question, are there fourth places that are social spheres where we actually collectively work on the questions of the future? And I think what you're describing with your obesity example, which I love, there's great amount of practitioners working in these niche spaces, in these expertise topical areas. But I do question, what are the forums? Where do we go to really develop new models of what the future looks like? There's only one MIT Media Lab. There's only one infamous Xerox PARC, but I think our world could do for an avalanche of fourth places that are forums for cooperatively imagining and developing the future.
100%. The word collective becomes difficult in America's polarized society these days. Quick side tangent before I forget about it. You tell me, I want to know, Willy Wonka, why was Gene Wilder a million times better than Depp? Why? And you know it's true. Even if you try to disagree with me on air, you know it's true.
This may be my favorite question of all the conversations in the book so far. And you know, I talk about Willy Wonka and Gene Wilder in the book. I love that. Thank you for that beautiful question. I think of Willy Wonka as a model of bringing awe and wonder into whether it's the youth mindset or an adult life. May we never grow up. I think Gene had a softness and a fragility. I mean, I think some of it is the shift in time. It might not be Johnny himself or Gene himself. To that from to juxtaposition we were talking about earlier, there's a kind of spectacle, there's a gloss that the new Willy Wonka contained that I think Gene didn't need, because there was a nuance and softness to let wonder almost quietly emerge, and you had to capture it, and it didn't require the World's Fair and parade to deliver.
It's, in a way, I'm not saying you were saying this, but it reminded me of, let's say, the Marvel films, which I really can't watch, where it just seems like so perfectly polished and produced. But not only was there a softness to Wilder, but there was just something, maybe there were some first takes in there. There was something authentic. There was something real, where I'm sure if Depp had the opportunity and he wasn't in some massive budget and it was so highly polished and whatnot, I'm sure he probably had the ability to take it a Wilder way. And that seems to have changed a lot in terms of cinema, at least.
Absolutely. And I think there's a broader lesson there about I love your term polish. I mean, there's a section of the book to talk about not being distracted by the shiny objects. There's a kind of plastic commodification of the stories we tell ourselves and the consumption that has overwhelmed our day to day. And I don't think it's fair to just make it a corollary of one good, the other bad. But I do think it's worth questioning and looking underneath the hood about where that polish really comes from and what are the character qualities that drives or emulates and satisfies satiated hunger within us. I happen to be a fan of Marvel, but not because of its polish. There's some interesting narratives and frameworks there about how we understand mythology in its deep rooted historic sense in a contemporary context. But I fear, to your point, that many of the viewers may not be fully resonating with the mythology and are just so excited about that polish that it's a distraction.
I can't deny the success of it. I was living in San Diego for several years. I saw the Comic-Con Unleashed and I was like, wow, I had no earthly idea. This is about a decade ago, but I had no earthly idea of the penetration. So all the props to the Marvel players for the business they've unfolded. It's amazing.
One of the more interesting versions, this is a little bit of a bridge to other themes, but I can't help but find the connection. I've seen some really beautiful language recently evolving the kind of buzz term of great resignation to the great simplification. I don't know if you've encountered this yet.
Teach me.
Well, it's interesting. I saw a couple films. There's some interesting op-eds I've read, and I think somehow it resonates with me more, this language of the great simplification. I mean, I think it relates to your Marvel questioning. I wonder if the speed in which we all live, the complexity in which we all live, that polish which we all live, it's faster, bigger, sexier. It's become an addiction. Personally, I don't have a romanticism about, things were better before technology. It's not that, but I do think there is a kind of reboot simplification that many of us are going through. I do think the pandemic forced us to question what really matters to us and what our priorities are and what kind of lives we want to lead. And I think there's some ecological humility. I think there's return to a longing for slowing down and choosing new kinds of values that maybe aren't all that new. This kind of from to is also embedded in those films, in those narratives we tell ourselves. I mean, one of the critiques I raise in the book is, where did we lose our desire to seek and imagine and build utopia? And dystopian films have become like $1 trillion industry. A list and with the actual dollars from the actual gross domestic or global box office of the narratives we tell ourselves of the world is over, the world is ending. We still talk about polish. We make spectacle of the conclusion of life. I'm really interested in how we celebrate life. That's a narrative that should be $1 trillion story.
Yeah, it's back to the beginning of our conversation in a way, which is just that exploration. I mentioned the dinosaur stuff. It's like that archaeological mindset. Let's go dig. Let's find something that we don't know is out there. And that joy from finding something that you don't know is out there is incalculable. The value of that. Oh my gosh. Again, back to bringing up education and stuff. How do we get that statement into the classroom? Kids might not even think they have permission to even go that direction because things are so structured and whatnot.
Look, I mean, when you talk about kids or you talk about do they know they have permission, I think one of the things we need to talk about is the economic inequity in the world is not just an economic condition. Earlier, you wove this really beautiful principle around freedom. And I think that the inequity that we see in economic indicators also carries through in terms of something I call question inequity. Who has the right to ask the questions? When you talk about permission, and that freedom. I mean, talk about controversial topics. What amount of the world believes or understands they have the power to ask questions? And how are those questions authored and where do they come to life? This is also a question of the distribution and the sharing. You talked about that dangerous term to the American ideal, that collective cooperation of really truly democratic power. And I think questions are one of the most extraordinary expressions of power that we have.
I never could have said this to you a decade ago. Across Asia, whether the government is a democracy or whether the government is communist, across Asia, and okay, all my Asian friends out there, you can have a radical disagreement or agreement with me, but most Asian countries are one party. What's so fascinating for me across Asia is the cultural cooperation. There's a certain homogeneity across Asian countries. It's different because when I hear the word democracy, as you might imagine, given where I'm at, I feel like I've got all the freedom in the world. Isn't that a funny thing? You know, I could have had this conversation with you a decade ago. I probably would have been somebody beating some drum and saying, oh, I'm never going over there. Dangerous people over there. It's so awful. They're going to kill you. You come over to a place like this and you're like, what the blazes propaganda? What were they putting down the fire hose in my throat? I'm not saying things are perfect anywhere. I'm just saying that there's so many stories and so many messages to unpack. Clearly, you and I could have this conversation and we could take it on for 10 hours, but we can't do that today.
No, of course, of course. I think that you're onto something interesting there, that I think it's an American idea, or just more broadly, it's an old idea that the number of parties, the number of political parties, the number of government structures equals democracy or equals diversity.
Or freedom.
Or, yeah, that big idea of freedom, to your point. Similar to an earlier point I was trying to raise about the role of comedians. I just think actually the bigger question, the more dangerous question, which is seductive to at least touch, is how relevant is government today? And it's not a yes or no question.
You're reading my mind, right? Okay.
Yeah.
You know exactly what I'm thinking.
I think younger generations are, I mean, it's always been the case, sure, but I think our ability to track it with data and really understand the sentiment of young people in a deeply complex and robust ways. Young people are disengaged, dissatisfied, and are not even truly quite involved in civic life in the way that generations before them were. I think that doesn't make them less critical to our civic imagination. I just think where that term civic is going to be located is just shifting its location. I mean, I'll say for myself, I don't look for inspiration or vision or innovation from my government. I mean, it would be silly to imagine Congress as an innovation lab. I don't even imagine that they see themselves as that any longer or ever. And I think that's a fascinating question about the social contract that we have as citizens with leaders. And maybe the most important leaders are no longer in government, and that's okay. But we need to kind of listen to that pattern and enable it to work with us and for us as we go through that cultural interregnum and define what comes next.
You open your work with a nice Johnny Ivy Apple story. People will have to go take a read, or you can explain, but I want to set something up. Let me see if I can frame this as a question. So there's a YouTube guy that I really like named Marcus Brownlee, and does these great videos on new tech and stuff. He's making a bundle. He's making a killing with it. He's probably like 30 years old. He's making a killing. Great videos. And he's every piece of high tech in the world. And he knows everything. When I watch him, I'm like, oh my God, I want to know everything too. But then I say to myself, then I get back to being my mindset of like, okay, I've been an Apple Mac user since 1990, a fan of Steve Jobs forever. The great thing about, for example, like the iPhone or an iPad tools that I use every day, I don't try to take them more and more and more. I use them for what I use them for. It's kind of like I got a couple different color pens in front of me right now. I'm okay with the pen. I'm okay with the iPhone. I'm okay with the iPad. And I love Marcus Brownlee's videos. Then I look at something like social media where it's like there's never enough. People I don't feel compelled because I've got kind of a certain stable perspective. I know who I am. I'm flexible enough on money and stuff. I can do what I want to do. But a lot of people feel compelled to participate in all these things, to participate in the newest tech, to participate in social media nonstop. This to me seems like a real difficult scenario that if people are in that foundation, then we got to shift them over to some radical curiosity. I mean, people have got a lot on their plate. I guess that's my point. They got a lot on their plate. Some of it is really cool stuff, as I give the compliment to Marcus, but what's enough? When do we reach enough? Where's satiation?
These are great questions. And I think what is enough is an extraordinary, essential question. It is an expression of radical curiosity. And I think part of radical curiosity, from my point of view, the practice, there's an elasticity. I think it's not helpful to have a kind of set of black and white, left or right, prescriptive frames. I think it's about asking questions about what works for you, but also asking questions about a systems view of how our collective decisions or the way that our marketplace is evolving is affecting the population scale, lifestyle and culture and systems. For me, I guess I would just offer that actually Steve Jobs was an extraordinarily curious person. I think that really the design mentality of the core design group that Johnny Ive led and continues to influence as a legacy at Apple is one of the most profoundly simplified and commitment to simplicity as possible from an industrial design point of view. I think what you're talking about when you say the quantity of pens, the quantity of colors, I think the software, the quantity of apps, the quantity of tools, when we make platforms, when we make truly democratic platforms that are arenas for other inventors to create. I saw a stat the other day, there's something like 80,000 apps just on healthcare alone. The App Store now has millions of apps. I think when you say people have a lot on their plate, I think we're living in a time where part of that slowing down, part of being present for yourself, that Jason Fried reference you shared earlier of not sleep, but REM work or REM life, to kind of live a radically curious life, you have to be an editor. You have to be a curator. You have to be a filter to decide what to let in and what not to let in.
I do that on this podcast. I mean, I find certain guests that I want to find, and a lot of very nice people in New York City with PR firms and publishers will reach out to me too. If I was to look through, probably if I was to toss my 1,000+ episodes into some AI, I'm sure it would tell me exactly what I'm going for. I like this professorial mindset, somebody that's done a deep dive. If you would have just said to me, okay, I have this particular one thing about myself, I'm not saying that would have sounded narcissistic, but that kind of thing doesn't interest me. What interests me is the ideas, the concepts, the discussions, the dialogue. That's what's exciting to me.
What I'd love for you and your audience to consider, and I think as I've gotten to know you a bit more on this discussion, this dialogue, I think you're a great expression of it. I think what you're talking about is what I call aliveness. The idea of aliveness is something that we're working on in our studio and in my practice. We're developing a few new ventures to really design aliveness. There's so much of our life we're protesting what doesn't work or we're preventing what is bad. But I think the next stage, the next maturation of what I'm calling a kind of activism is not just to say this is wrong or this is good, this is bad, but to move from a critique to unleashing an imagination for what a better model could look like. And I think that often happens, but it doesn't happen at scale, or it doesn't happen as a key undermining of some of those legacy narrative assumptions you and I spoke about. And I think I say yes to life. We're talking about sustainability, but I don't want to just sustain. I think we all want to flourish. We all want to come alive. That joy you describe of that archaeological dig. And I think whether it's experience design and it's as basic as a joyful moment of extraordinary food and culture, or it's at a systems level to upend that inequity of questioning, I think we need to design for aliveness. One of the synthesis outcomes of embracing a leadership practice of radical curiosity is to really design your life, design the organizations, design the ventures that we all commit so much of our passion and our life around to really make aliveness come alive.
I'll save it for last as just kind of a throw in, but it's a very important throw in. A few words that I jotted down from your work, which I really love. I think it's one of those ones that needs to go up on my wall. Never forget how you make them feel. Never forget how you make them feel. Now, if we all did that, that would be a radical step forward.
Absolutely. The book is peppered with a diversity of voices that I've really looked to as icons and North Star compass guides during a moment of uncertainty. And I think what you're referencing, that great Maya quote, also Toni Morrison, who talked about this is when we do language. Really been during the pandemic thinking a great deal about that beautiful quote that was a part of her Nobel acceptance speech. She said, this is when artists go to work, and there's real work to be done. I mean, I think to your point of the YouTube channel, which I haven't seen, I'll have to look it up. It's not that I'm against shiny objects. I just think the new business and innovation frontier may no longer be about making the 313,000th app. It might be that we need to get back to the human condition questions of water and food and housing and really bring all of the ingenuity that can make that spectacle of that Marvel film and apply it to some of the most core questions that seem to have eluded us for centuries. That's an exciting new frontier of no longer just calling them social entrepreneurs and putting them as do-gooders in the corner, but maybe the new MBA will be about purpose. That's a world I'd be excited by.
The book, Radical Curiosity, Questioning Commonly Held Beliefs to Imagine Flourishing Futures. Seth, very cool stuff. I will say that I did not take you down any kind of linear path with your book, but it really is a deep dive. And I would be shocked if the average person that has an interest in design, business, etc., can't pull some really useful information. You've got some great charts in here, but just the way of, I'll give a shout out to another Seth though, too. Sounds like you probably have some familiarity with Seth Godin. Just great stuff. I've got printed out in front of me right now, this one page 105, how to ask an essential question. I didn't read it while we were talking, but your whole page of essential questions. This is something, one of those ones you just kind of put on the wall. Great stuff. Seth, is there a website you would like to send people to? We can direct people to find you. You're easily found.
I appreciate it. Yeah, the website is curiosityand.company. Not the typical .com extension. It's curiosityand.company.
Now, I think I know to this brief question, you can give a brief answer. I think I know the answer. This is a very typical, normal interview for you. Exactly like this, right?
I would say that what I enjoyed was your format is so much more conversational. It felt more like a kind of Socratic seminar, and we were old friends having a coffee. This has been a fourth space, to make that reference, where even though we haven't known each other for a great deal of time, you've created a space that holds a trust and a pacing to really peel back layers of questions and ask about the future. So thank you for that. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it. This is just kind of like a hobby for me. It's just kind of one of those fun things to do. I get to talk to all these interesting people while I'm 8,000 miles away from you. I'd be crazy not to do that, right?
Absolutely. It's a good life.
Seth, you take care, and please keep me posted on future work.
Absolutely. Thanks for the time. Appreciate it.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash, or just trying to make a lot of money. Trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.